Deploying more antennas closer to end users allows carriers to squeeze more out of existing spectrum. Now, there's still resistance to siting this equipment where it's necessary, and Congress can help even more to remove these barriers. One way is by streamlining the process of siting wireless infrastructure on federal lands. Despite the law enacted by Congress with the leadership of this committee and an executive order by the President, significant challenges remain on federal property. Further legislation to facilitate access to federal lands will expand broadband coverage and increase deployment in rural areas. PCI supports S1618, which was recently introduced in the Senate to address this issue, and we look forward to continuing to work with this committee on developing legislation as well. Additional roadblocks remain despite the assistance this committee has provided. For example, some state and local entities require proof of need before authorizing infrastructure bills. These requirements are both illogical and costly. Local communities shouldn't be in the CTO business of deciding where services are needed. Our members invest their capital where it's needed to serve consumers, and local governments aren't in a good position to be second-guessing these kind of technical questions. Continued efforts to harmonize the rates for pole attachments would also help promote broadband investment. The FCC has taken important steps to provide greater access, timing, and fair rates. States that regulate their own poles should follow the FCC's lead. In sum, wireless infrastructure boosts every sector of the economy. Mobile broadband is demonstrating its effectiveness in promoting economic growth, job creation, and global competitiveness. Yet challenges remain in reaching its full potential. Policymakers from Congress to local governments need to eliminate regulatory barriers so our industry can invest their capital without resistance and not add costs and delays that will slow the rollout of wireless broadband. Our member companies are very grateful for the bipartisan recognition of the centrality of wireless infrastructure by this committee, by Congress, by the administration, and by the FCC. I would add that we look forward to making continued progress together on some of the ideas we've laid out here today, and my other panelists will share. And we thank you, and thank you, Ranking Member Eshoo, for joining us, and thank you for holding this hearing to address these urgent issues.
Thank you, Mr. Adelstein. We appreciate your testimony. Look forward to further discussions on these matters. We'll now go to the Honorable Stephen Rowe Lewis, Governor of the Gila River Indian Community in Arizona. Governor, we're delighted to have you here. I enjoyed the time I was in your community and toured your facilities, and we're glad you could be here to share your thoughts on the challenges you face.
Thank you, Chairman Walden and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on behalf of the Gila River Indian community. I also want to, again, thank Chairman Walden and Mr. Lujan for visiting the community, as you just heard, to see firsthand the obstacles that tribes face in deploying broadband. And I want to thank Ranking Member Eshoo and Mr. Lujan for their request to have the Government Accounting Office, the GAO, look into the challenges and barriers to deployment on tribal lands. Our broadband provider is Gila River Telecommunications Incorporated, which we refer to as GRTI. It was founded in 1988 and is wholly owned by our community. Our reservation is approximately 372,000 acres. We have more than 20,000 members and almost 12,000 community members living on our reservation. When we first purchased the exchange from Mountain Bell in 1988, only 10% of our residents had access to basic phone service. More, those looking to get connected had to pay tens of thousands of dollars before Mountain Bell would install a party line connection. Today, GRTI offers phone service to 100% of our residents, and 84% of the residents subscribe. We also offer broadband service across the reservation. We are very proud of GRTI's success. GRTI, along with the National Tribal Telecommunications Association, work together to raise awareness about the unique challenges for deploying broadband on tribal lands. Tribal lands are the least served areas in the country. Approximately 48% of tribal lands in the lower 48 states lack access to speeds of 10 down, 1 up, and 68% lack access to 25 down and 3 up. There are a number of obstacles that present challenges to broadband deployment on tribal lands, and I have set those out with more detail in my written testimony, but I would like to summarize them for you here. First, population density is an obstacle. Gila River, for example, is at 20 persons per square mile. Maricopa County, which is adjacent to the reservation, has approximately 414 persons per square mile. Rugged terrain, characterized by mountains and hard soil, is also typical of tribal lands. Low median income and high rates of poverty on most reservations present a severe challenge for the delivery of broadband. The median income on our reservation is $24,000 to $59,000 in Arizona. Approximately 48% of the persons living on the reservation live below the poverty level, compared to 15% for Arizona. These economic circumstances are not unique to our tribal community. Failed federal policies from the past continue to negatively impact many tribes. Our community, and others like it, continue to struggle with the failed policy of allotment. Because of the allotment policy, obtaining rights of way in order to deploy broadband is complex and raises costs substantially and delays deployment. Finally, access to capital is a barrier. Tribal lands cannot be leveraged as collateral for securing loans because they are held in trust by the United States for the benefit of the tribe. Thus, private capital is often not available, meaning the only lender available is the federal government, specifically the Rural Utility Service. RUS loans were critical to GRTI when it took over its service area and remains critical, as the Warm Springs Tribe in Oregon can attest. The combination of these challenges has resulted in GRTI's average cost per loop being over $2,873. Because tribal nations face many unique challenges, we often need unique solutions. Having tribes at the table and engaging in government-to-government consultation is critical. Too often, federal policies have unintended consequences on tribes because we weren't properly consulted in the beginning. The current effort to reform the Universal Service Fund is a good example. USF is, when properly scoped, a critically important source of funding that can help make it possible to deploy broadband to our reservations. Tribes have offered a proposal that would target specific support to tribal lands through a tribal broadband factor. That could be added to proposals for a standalone broadband fund. Inclusion of this tribal broadband factor would promote the targeted use of universal service funding to advance the policy objective of ensuring that broadband is made available to all Americans, including those living on tribal lands. The FCC's Office of Native American Affairs and Policy has been a welcome addition to the Commission's outreach efforts to ensure that tribes are included in the development of proposals to deploy more broadband. But sometimes the FCC forgets about tribes. That's why we appreciate the letter sent to the FCC from a bipartisan group of members of this committee, reminding the Commission that tribal leaders need a seat at the table. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today and hope to be an ongoing resource for the committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor. You can count on that. We appreciate your testimony and your insights. They're very valuable. We'll go now to Craig Moffett, Senior Research Analyst, Moffett-Nathanson. Mr. Moffett, we're delighted to have you here as well. Please go ahead.
Thank you, members of the subcommittee, for your kind invitation to participate in today's hearing. By way of introduction, I've been a financial analyst focusing on the cable and telecommunications industries for the past 14 years. Before that, I spent 11 years at the Boston Consulting Group advising telecommunications companies. So this is now my 25th year in the sector, and I've spent much of that career focused on issues of broadband deployment and microeconomics. With that in mind, I thought I would share some general observations today about the economics of broadband, particularly focusing on the economics of competitive broadband. First, I would start by saying the obvious. Infrastructure deployment requires the expectation of a healthy return on capital. That should be taken as a given, but all too often in my experience, the issue of return on capital is either ignored or misunderstood in policy forums. It's not a matter of whether a business is or isn't profitable. It is instead a matter of whether a business is sufficiently profitable to warrant the high levels of capital investment required for the deployment of infrastructure. With that in mind, in 2014, the largest companies in the cable industry earned a very healthy return. The physical assets of Comcast, Time Warner Cable, Charter, and Cablevision, the four publicly traded U.S. cable operators during 2014, all earned healthy returns in excess of their cost of capital, with returns ranging from 13% to 33%. Those returns are unusually high for a capital-intensive industry. On the other hand, it should be noted that the cable industry earned returns below the cost of capital for decades. Any long-term return on network infrastructure has to earn returns well in excess of the cost of capital during the maturity of that network to offset what were typically years or even decades of losses. By contrast, large incumbent telephone companies do not earn attractive returns on their wireline businesses. For example, a decade after first undertaking their Fios fiber to the home build-out to 18 million homes, Verizon has not yet come close to earning a return in excess of their cost of capital. In 2014, their aggregate wired infrastructure business earned a paltry 1.2% return against a cost of capital of 5%. For the non-financial types in the room, that's the equivalent of borrowing money at 5% interest in order to earn 1% interest. That's a good way to go bankrupt. No one would undertake to replicate those disastrous financial returns. AT&T, which at around the same time began deploying a much less robust and therefore less costly fiber to the node network, has also earned poor returns. Their ROIC, or return on invested capital, has been declining for a decade and is, like Verizon's, well below the cost of capital. AT&T is committed to the FCC to make fiber available to a total of, I now believe it's 12.5 million homes as of what was reported last night, to their footprint in order to make their acquisition of DirecTV more palatable to policymakers, but it's hard to be optimistic that they will do much better this time around. That said, there have been some changes in the market that make deployment of competitive broadband networks less unattractive than they have been in the past. Corning has developed bendable fiber that has helped lower the labor cost of deployment. Google has popularized the concept of demand aggregation, whereby communities pledge to subscribe to advanced network services before the network is built so that Google can target areas where the company has the best chance of earning an acceptable return. And while some critics would call that redlining, as it typically means that broadband won't be built to the lower income communities, it has been successful in boosting overall project returns, and you can think of it as a way of ensuring that all the children in the class really are above average. Still, the broader takeaway here is that the returns to be had from overbuilding, that is, being the second or third broadband provider in a given market, are generally poor. So let that sink in for a moment. Simply stated, it means that market forces are unlikely to yield a fully competitive broadband market. Neither, by the way, does wireless appear to offer the promise of imminent competition for incumbent wired broadband providers. Wireless networks simply aren't engineered for the kind of sustained throughput required for wired broadband replacement services. And wireless networks, by the way, also generally earn relatively poor returns on capital. Returns for Verizon and AT&T are middling, and for Sprint and T-Mobile are very poor as a consequence of aggressive price competition in the wireless market. Neither is satellite broadband a compelling replacement for wired broadband in any but the most rural areas. Costs are high, and it is the nature of satellite connection that it has to travel 22,000 miles and back, such that latency is going to be a problem. So the simple economic reality is that overbuilding is necessarily going to be somewhat limited, given relatively poor financial returns that can be expected, and that alternatives are far and few between. That naturally gives rise to the impulse among some to regulate incumbent networks that are already there. That is, it is a not unreasonable assumption that any attempts to foster competition will be unreasonable or will ultimately be unsuccessful, and that regulation of incumbents, in this case the cable operators, is therefore required. The counter-argument that regulation will only stifle investment among incumbent providers and will therefore make the problem worse and will in the process generate unwelcome unintended consequences is equally well-intentioned and unfortunately is equally well supported by the historical evidence. That is to say, there are no easy answers here. I'll conclude only by adding a few additional observations about the cable industry. As everyone understands, the cable video business is facing unprecedented pressure. Cord cutting has been talked about for years, but is finally starting to show up in a meaningful way in the numbers, and soaring programming costs are eating away at video profit margins. From a cable operator's perspective, the video business and the broadband business are opposite sides of the same coin. It is, after all one infrastructure. Pressure on the video profit pool will therefore naturally trigger a pricing response in broadband where cable operators have greater leverage. That may sound nefarious, but it's not intended to be so. It's simply an observation that cable operators have historically benefited from the fact that their infrastructure can support two separate businesses, and each can be delivered at a lower cost than if that were not the case. The ACA, or American Cable Association, has made this case eloquently in arguing that absent reforms to restrain runaway programming cost growth, video will be unprofitable, and broadband will be left to carry the entire burden of incremental deployment. All else being equal, that will mean that even new builds of broadband will become increasingly economically challenged and therefore will become less and less likely. Or, as I'm quick to add, this is my own editorial rather than ACA's point, they will simply have to sharply raise the price of broadband. As an analyst, I would simply observe that the pressures in the video business are relatively broad-based and are attributable to more than just programming cost inflation, and that this may therefore be an unavoidable scenario. So I'll leave my remarks there. If my remarks sound excessively gloomy, they're not meant to. The U.S. broadband infrastructure is the envy of the world, notwithstanding my view that there are politicized and cherry-picked statistics that would suggest otherwise. It's simply the case that broadband is an infrastructure that is very difficult to support two of, and in some cases even one of, and I would submit that a clear-eyed acknowledgement of the microeconomics of the broadband business deserves or even demands a seat at the policy table. So thank you, Mr. Chairman and subcommittee members, for your time and the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moffett. We appreciate your analysis. We'll go now to Michael Slinger, Director, Google Fiber Cities. We welcome you. Thank you for being here, and the floor is yours.
Chairman Walden, Ranking Member.
You will need to pull a microphone very close and push the little button there till the light stays on.
Chairman Walden, Ranking Member Eshoo, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to testify today about investment in broadband infrastructure. We believe a successful agenda for bandwidth abundance will benefit consumers, small businesses, and the economy. My name is Michael Slinger, and I currently serve as a Director of Google Fiber City Teams. In this role, I oversee the operations, business strategy, and on-the-ground outreach to bring gigabit speeds to cities where we deploy Google Fiber across the United States. We have long believed that the next chapter of the internet will be built on gigabit speeds. A gig delivers enough bandwidth for everyone in the home or in the small business for all their devices. And we know fast connections unleash innovation and entrepreneurship. Think about it in these terms. If today we're riding a bike, having a gig means that we could be driving a race car. It's just that much faster. That's why we launched Google Fiber, which provides download and upload connections of up to 1,000 megabits per second. Our goal is to make the web faster, more affordable, more relevant, and more useful for everyone. We launched the service 5 years ago, and today it's available in Kansas City, Kansas, Kansas City, Missouri, Austin, Texas, and Provo, Utah. In addition, we're in the process of building out our network in 6 other markets, and we're exploring bringing it to another 4 on top of that. In rolling out Google Fiber, we physically build a network from scratch, 1 street, 1 pole, 1 house at a time. This means reviewing infrastructure and working closely with cities to make sure we're ready to work together to design and build a brand new network. This experience has given us insight into barriers to deployment. I'll outline some thoughts on policy changes that could reduce delays and barriers. First, policymakers can ease gaining access to existing infrastructure. To construct high-speed networks, broadband providers need access to existing utility infrastructure, such as poles, conduits, on a consistent, cost-effective, and timely basis. While the FCC has taken important steps to improve rules related to infrastructure access, our own experience in building new broadband networks demonstrates that more work needs to be done to reduce delays and barriers. Second, policymakers can ease rights-of-way. The expense and complexity of obtaining access to public rights-of-way in some jurisdictions may increase the cost and slow the pace of broadband deployment. Policies that facilitate partnerships between different entities and companies that are doing local construction can be beneficial. We also see a lot of benefit in instituting dig once policies, which may involve the installation of an oversized conduit bank by any new network builder within the right-of-way. Third, policymakers can help resolve the challenge of high rates for access to video programming. This would help smaller players in the business negotiate fair terms for access to popular broadcast and cable content and make it easier to attract and retain subscribers for broadband networks. Finally, I would be remiss if I failed to mention the importance of balanced spectrum policies that promote innovation in the wireless sector. Federal agencies should pursue a balanced approach to spectrum reallocation that allows for licensed and unlicensed commercial uses at a variety of frequencies. I will note, as we think about deploying gigabit speed networks, we need to keep in mind that about 30% of Americans still don't use the internet at home. This means they are at a disadvantage when it comes to education, job opportunities, social and civic engagement. So one of our main priorities in building digital inclusion into our deployment plans from the beginning. We are guided by a couple of main principles: make the internet more affordable, make access a part of the community, and teach people how to get online. Just last week, as part of the Connect Home initiative announced by President Obama and HUD Secretary Castro, we committed to bringing our Google Fiber internet service to residents in select affordable housing properties across our fiber cities for $0 per month with no installation fee. We are also partnering with community organizations on computer labs and digital literacy programming. We're grateful for the partners we get to work with to get more people connected and for your attention to this important topic. Thank you again for the invitation to speak at this hearing and to share our views on how we can remove barriers, give Americans more choices at higher speeds, and help reach the goal of nationwide broadband abundance.
Thank you, Mr. Slinger. We appreciate your testimony. And now we'll go to our final witness today, Deb Socia, Executive Director, Next Century Cities. We're delighted to have you here as well. Thank you, and please go ahead with your comments.
Good afternoon. Thank you for holding this hearing on such an important topic. My name is Deb Socia, and I'm the Executive Director of Next Century Cities, a bipartisan city-to-city collaborative formed just last October. We have already grown to over 100 member cities, all of whom are dedicated to ensuring access to fast, affordable, and reliable broadband. High-speed access is essential to America's economic future. It's as simple as that. What can be complicated is making it happen on the ground. Cities face a range of technical, economic, and political challenges, including obstacles at the state and federal levels. More and more, providing for this critical need has emerged as a core responsibility for local governments. Many cities and towns from around the country are taking diverse and creative steps to secure their internet future. When it comes to providing access to high-quality internet, everyone has a role to play. It's an issue that spans political party, an issue that crosses the urban-rural divide, and an issue that relies on many sectors of our society. There is no single pathway to next-generation broadband network, and several of the most innovative solutions have emerged in unexpected places. The small towns of Ammon, Idaho, and Mount Vernon, Washington, have each developed a gigabit open-access network. These local governments are directly involved in building the physical infrastructure and then leasing access to competing private providers. Just outside of Baltimore, Westminster, Maryland has initiated a public-private partnership with Ting, a provider of fiber internet service. And with the introduction of Google Fiber in Kansas City, residents there can now experience gig-level speeds at an affordable rate. Cities like Lafayette, Louisiana, and Chattanooga, Tennessee have built their own networks and now have some of the fastest, most globally competitive access available. Next Century Cities is dedicated to helping all communities achieve high-quality access regardless of the path they choose to pursue. Our membership represents an inclusive cross-section of America, from small rural communities such as Winthrop, Minnesota, to large urban areas like LA and Boston. What unites these mayors is a commitment to the imperative of broadband access for continued growth, and an understanding that local governments are best situated to understand and provide for the needs of their residents. It's an exciting time, a time for creative local solutions to usher in a new generation of innovation as the internet continues to transform all aspects of society. Next Century Cities recently developed a policy agenda showing how multiple stakeholders can help communities develop the crucial infrastructure needed today. Consistent with our mission, this new resource provides guidance that will be useful to communities regardless of how they choose to pursue their broadband goals. Part of the policy agenda looks at steps local and state government can use to ensure high-quality access. Locally, governments can institute Dig Once policies that minimize disruption, as well as take other steps to ensure their cities are fiber-ready. At the state level, the policy agenda addresses changes such as modernizing state regulations and making investments in the middle-mile infrastructure. But we're here on Capitol Hill today, and I wanted to emphasize some recommendations we heard from mayors about steps the federal government could take to help empower local communities. First and foremost, Congress can encourage competitive local markets through national legislation and other avenues. In addition, you have the ability to provide a national platform for the issue of broadband as necessary infrastructure. Hearings such as this help to elevate this discussion and attract national attention to this critical issue. And finally, the policy agenda discusses how Congress could better require information about available Internet access, including speed of connection, price for consumers, and areas of operation for service providers. As is clear from everything we've heard so far today, the need for fast, affordable, and reliable broadband Internet access is undeniable. Innovative leaders in communities across the country recognize this urgent need and are developing the critical broadband infrastructure that will allow their residents and their cities to thrive. It's evident by the over 100 Next Century cities I'm speaking on behalf of today, communities that represent over 18 million Americans. Thank you for providing this platform for communities to share their experiences and develop opportunities for collaboration with federal policymakers. I look forward to working with members of this committee and your colleagues to ensure that communities across the country have the next generation access that all Americans need and deserve. Thank you.
Ms. Socia, thank you very much for your testimony and your insights. I'll start off with questions. Commissioner Adelstein, as you probably know, the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act directed the GSA, Government Service Agency, to develop a master contract to simplify the placement of wireless antennas on federal buildings and other property. Last year, the administrator of the GSA told Congress that the master contract was complete and available for use by executive landholding agencies. In your opinion, do you believe the GSA, General Services Administration, has done everything in its power to give life to the siting directives embodied in Section 6409, which you referenced in your testimony, of the Middle Class Tax Relief Act? Have they done everything they can?
Mr. Chairman, I do not believe they have. As a matter of fact, I'm a former administrator myself of a federal agency, and if I'd implemented something so poorly that Congress directed me to do, I'd be embarrassed, frankly. And it's worse than that because the executive branch has well ordered them. There's an executive order by the President of the United States directing GSA to move faster to try to get these master contracts together. And to date, nothing's been done. 3 years after Congress enacted this legislation, progress has been slow. GSA hasn't been proactive. The law required standard rates, common forms, and applications to provide clarity to agencies in the wireless industry. And I think our members now are having to negotiate for each and every site individually, just as they have in the past. So GSA has not implemented the intent of Congress, and we can't wait 3 more years for what's needed. I think today there's an urgent lack of coverage on federal lands. The administration's made a priority of this. This committee's made a priority, and yet GSA, I think, has been dragging its heels. I think there might be a need for further legislation.
Or maybe a hearing with one witness. They always like those. I appreciate that. And for the rest of the panel, if there are issues you're running into with the federal siting side of this, let us know, because this is one we raise because it's important, and we concur with what Commissioner Adelstein has said. I don't think they've got it right yet or done. Ms. Socia, traditionally, network operators were given a monopoly in exchange for the obligation to serve anyone upon reasonable request. In the models we've been discussing, carriers only deploy to areas where there's an economic case for the build. How do we balance sound network economies with the threat of redlining, the practice of refusing service to areas that are deemed a poor financial risk? And as I heard about the incredible build-out that Google is doing, which I applaud, representing a district that's bigger than a state east of the Mississippi, getting access out into our tribal lands, getting access out into our very remote and rural communities, whether it's wired or wireless, remains a big problem. And so I wonder how we can address that better.
I think the interesting thing about when you think about profit, I think that is a problem across the board with building out to these more rural locations, and therefore requires an influx of capital. There just isn't a way to do this without support. But I think the ways that our cities are looking at what is a profit are a little bit different than the ways that a company might look at what a profit is, right? So it's about education, it's about public safety, it's about economic development and transportation, and all of these opportunities that are presented when you have access. And so what is that worth? And how do we ensure that our tribal lands and our rural communities can benefit in the same ways that our other communities are able to?
Before I go to Mr. Moffitt for his comments, this is also an issue just in getting wireless phone coverage out into areas. Montana, upstate New York, Elise Stefanik has made this case to me, our new member from up there, that just getting access, getting connectivity remains a real issue. The job is not done. Right. And so, Mr. Moffitt, from your perspective as an analyst, what do we do?
Well, I would certainly agree with Ms. Sosha's comments that it is simply not realistic to think that those projects are going to be entirely self-funding in the more rural areas. That said, I think the targeting of the funds that are available, the Connect America funds, can be improved such that those funds are more carefully directed to new greenfield projects that really are bringing broadband to places that haven't been served in the past. There is always some controversy around whether an area is either partially served or sufficiently
Right.
served. And then secondarily, I think it's also important that those Connect America funds be made available to all manner of companies so that there can be more competition of potential providers of those services.
I want to get a quick answer, Mr. Slinger. Does Google have plans to try a model out in sort of rural, remote areas of the country, too, to see if you can make that work?
Well, as you know, fiber may not be the right solution technologically for rural areas. We want to make sure that there's sufficient spectrum available for unlicensed wireless technologies, as well as, you know, we're experimenting with balloon technology through Project Loon, and as well with fixed-wing aircraft out of New Mexico. So we think that in rural areas, it may be new technologies that are going to affordably bring internet to those areas.
Hate to cut you off, but I know we're all tight for time, so I'll turn to my colleague from California, Ms. Eshu.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, for having this very important hearing and for the high level of cooperation relative to witnesses and invitations. We appreciate it. Jonathan, it's great to see you, former commissioner at the FCC, and to everyone that accepted our invitation to be here today. Mr. Slinger and Ms. Sosha, first of all, thank you for your important advocacy for the Dig Once policy. I wish that the Congress had passed it, because I think that we'd have more of that policy actually, excuse the expression, embedded in our federal roadways. But how do you think, A, the executive order is working? I want to get my questions out first, okay? Because the time is very brief. And if you think there are any additional steps that Congress should take to incent that deployment of conduit as part of the federal highway projects and that system, which I don't know, right now it doesn't seem like the highway project system is going anywhere. It's looked like it's just being driven off the road in Congress. But anyway, here, maybe we can concentrate on that. Mr. Moffett, I listened very carefully to what you said, and it's I think really highly pessimistic. I mean, it was depressing to listen to your description of every last sector of the telecommunications marketplace. And my question to you would be, where do you see a bright spot? To Governor Lewis, thank you for being here. You know, there was a report that just came out in terms of broadband penetration in our country. We're 24th in the world. And I think that a good part of that number is a representation of Native Americans and reservations in our country. It's a shameful record. It's a shameful record. And I think if there is going to be something that moves up to the top of the list here in a bipartisan way, is to see that we bring to the parts of the country where there are reservations, that you get first-class service for first-class citizenship. You really do. I mean, for students to have to be driven by their parents 65 and 75 miles away to sit in the car in order to get some kind of connection to do their homework, I don't think any member of Congress who's a parent here would ever put up with that. We shouldn't have that in our country. And I hope that Mr. Slinger and Governor Lewis will form a partnership. And then come back and report to us. I'd really like to have you meet and see what you can come up with, because you both need each other, and we need both of you. To Ms. Sosha, do you support, Next Century Cities support the having local municipal systems?
We support whatever it is our local communities need to do in order to get where they're going, right? So
Well, that doesn't answer my question, though.
Okay.
It's too broad, excuse the
I understand.
term.
Many of our mayors signed on to a letter we sent to the FCC in support of the preemption.
Okay.
The two cities that filed petitions, Chattanooga and Wilson, are two of our cities. And we believe deeply in the idea that competition is important, and we believe deeply in the idea that local folks should be able to solve their local problems in a way that makes sense.
Well, I come from local government, so I agree with you, and I think that they should have the opportunity to do that as well. Jonathan, I regularly hear from constituents who are frustrated with the tower siting process. Now, here's one for you. Everyone wants great service, the best service in the whole wide world, but no one wants a wireless tower in their backyard or where they can see it anywhere near where they live. So how do you respond to this? The people that say that reforms need to be made to take away local jurisdictions say over the placement of cell towers. It's really it's like trying to get socks on an octopus. I mean, they want it, they don't want it. And yet there are some have-tos in this. So those are my questions, and you have 13 seconds to answer them. Oh, no, you don't have any time because I'm over time. But you can respond in writing, and that way I'll get more meat on the bones, I think. So thank you for being here, and please, Mr. Slinger and Governor Lewis, come together, and if my office, other offices can help facilitate, let us know.
General Lay's time's expired. Turn to the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thanks very much for our panel today. It's always a great discussion that we have in subcommittee. Mr. Adelson, if I could go back to some of the questions that the chairman was posing, and also I think you said about the GSA dragging its feet and getting some of these things done, especially when we're talking about streamlining the process for providers to obtain the necessary permitting and other approvals needed to build on federal lands and protected lands. Just out of curiosity, on average, how long does it take for a negotiation process with the federal government compared to the private industry? Any idea?
Yeah, it takes about 4 years with the federal government, less than half of that with the private sector. And sometimes it can drag on much longer with the federal government for many, many years. And so generally, private companies will just avoid federal lands because it takes so long. They don't see the return on investment that Craig was talking about. And so the federal government's actually deprived of that revenue because it'll go right next door if there's non-federal land nearby.
Okay, when you say that then, so you're saying that on average it's 4, but it can drag out even longer.
That's right.
And any idea, any ideas or examples of how long some of them have taken over 4 years?
Yeah, I've heard from people it's taken 10 years and longer. I've heard that sometimes you've tried and it never gets done. And there's never even a finality to it. There's no decision-making process that's in place. That's why this committee in its wisdom said that the GSA was supposed to take steps to standardize the process, and yet it hasn't been done.
Okay. Let me follow up with that. Because of that, 4 to 10 or who knows, or maybe into infinity and beyond, what additional costs are incurred when the federal government is unable to streamline its process for the broadband infrastructure build-out?
Well, there's lost revenue. There's huge cost to trying to go through that process for the individuals who are trying to get the site acquisition done. It's a shame. 30% of all the land mass in the United States is federal property, especially in rural areas. And there are a lot of very valuable federal buildings in dense urban, which could use a facility as well to deal with the capacity demands. So it's a shame that these negotiations take so long, that they don't lead anywhere. Not only do you lose revenue that you need for deficit reduction, the companies lose valuable places, and the consumers lose access to service they need.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Slinger, I think in your testimony you were talking about the percentage of the population out there that does not have access to broadband, and what percentage of that would that be?
we're seeing now, the stats that we're seeing is about 60 million Americans. In some of our cities that we're working in right now, 25 to 30% of people have never had an internet connection at home. They have access, they may have access through cell phones, but they don't have an internet connection at home.
Okay, just two quick follow-ups on that then, because again, I represent from urban to very, very rural. And when you look at the numbers then and or the percentages, when you have, what percentage of that would be urban, suburban, very rural, and that percentage when you talk about that, was it 60 million?
Yes.
And how would that break down? And also, how many people would that include that would not want to have the access to broadband?
I don't have a breakdown of urban versus rural within the numbers. But again, in urban areas, I can say in many cities that 25%, 30% of these cities, residents don't have anything at home at all. No internet connection.
Okay, thank you. Governor, if I could turn to you, and again, thanks very much for being here with us today and for your testimony. Because again, you said that you have a very, very rural population. I think you said that you have about 20 persons per square mile, and it's great concern in your areas, along with all the rural areas in the country, about having that essential broadband for our constituents. And you talked about the USF and what that would help you. But are there other areas besides the USF that you could see that would be a benefit to you and your community?
Thank you for that question. And first of all, I'd like to recognize that I have two of my council members here, Councilman Devin Redbird and Councilwoman Carolyn Williams, and also from our GRTI, Gila River Telecommunications, Belinda Nelson and Pamela Thomas from the Gila River Indian Community.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I would say that one critical issue is rights-of-way. And, rights-of-way is a challenge where it's a complex issue. It has to do with the nature of tribal land. It goes back, as I said, to the allotment policy that had a devastating effect on tribal lands. And so the short answer is that GRTI, in regards to right-of-ways, if they do not get right-of-ways, we have to build around it. And of course, that costs, it's very capital intensive. And so we either have to move to another route, or where we can, in some cases, have to build a wireless link to go over the right-of-way. And obviously, this is pretty costly as compared to trenching through an established right-of-way. But sometimes this is our only course of action. That is an issue that we really need to look at. Another is the ETC and designation process, which is overly complicated. And so streamlining of that ETC designation process would be a welcome to many tribes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My time's expired, and I yield back.
Thank you. We'll now recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to get one question into Mr. Edelstein about infrastructure during disasters like Hurricane Sandy, but then I want to get a question into Governor Lewis, so I'm trying to split this up. 3 years ago, Hurricane Sandy devastated my district. The force of the storm knocked out some communication for days. Mr. Edelstein, you testified about all the wireless infrastructure that's being deployed and upgraded across the country, and I support all of this deployment, but my constituents are also concerned about whether the equipment works in a disaster. So what is your industry doing to make sure people can call for help and reach loved ones in an emergency? And what do you think of the FCC's work to improve resiliency?
Well, ensuring
2 minutes.
ensuring reliable access to telecommunications is a real top priority for our industry. We want to make sure all of the customers get access when they need it most, which is in a disaster. During Hurricane Sandy, we saw cooperation, for example, between T-Mobile and AT&T that agreed to share each other's network in the region affected by the storm and share their network operations centers. I would say that in terms of the structures themselves, not one of them went down during the storm, not one. The issue was things that were beyond the control, power companies, access to roads, trees that fell. But what makes it difficult is that sometimes we can't even get generators sited on these things. Going back to the issue of this committee, we find from localities say you can't put a generator there because it violates a noise statute. It's only going to be used in a time of emergency. I don't think anybody in the neighborhood would complain about the noise of a generator when otherwise their phone wouldn't work. And yet localities will not allow us to put them there and then complain when the system doesn't work. in a disaster. We need more proactive thinking about having backup power and facilitating access to it. And one more point to add, which is the best thing you can do for reliability is redundancy. The more these facilities are up, the more likely you're going to have one that works in a time of emergency. So all of the work done by this committee to promote deployment is promoting redundancy and ensuring that there will be adequate facilities in case of emergency and more likelihood that they will survive the disaster and be available for use of public safety as well as for the citizens in the community.
Do you want to comment on the FCC's work? Because Chairman Wheeler committed to me that the FCC would act by the end of the year to complete its rulemaking on improving wireless network resiliency.
We're thrilled with what the FCC is doing. We've worked very closely with Chairman Wheeler and the other members of the commission. They're looking at a cooperative arrangement where we can try to provide incentives for industry to deploy this kind of equipment. I think the industry is doing a lot already, making major investments in things like backup power, and we're working together with them in a very cooperative fashion. We believe that the goals are shared of making sure that these networks are resilient and redundant.
All right, thank you. Let me go to Governor Lewis, and I should say that I love the Gila River Reservation. I haven't been there in a long time. It's about time I go back. But, you know, on the one hand, I was thinking that I guess relative to many tribes, you might have more ability than even some of the, you know, more remote or even, you know, poorer tribes, if you will, you know, to achieve some of the goals that you mentioned. So I just wanted to ask about funding. You mentioned the Universal Service Fund. I guess the gentleman from Google talked about this Connect Home initiative. I think the president was actually at the Choctaw Reservation last week or so talking about that. I mean, what are these sources of funding? Is the Universal Service Fund useful to you now? What would we have to do to improve it? How, you know, what could the federal government do in terms of funding for tribal infrastructure? You know, particularly, you know, for those tribes that might even have even more difficulty. I mean, I'm thinking of like the Pueblos in New Mexico or the tribes at the Grand Canyon, you know, smaller than Gila River, less funding available. How are these funds helpful to you, the ones that we do have, or these programs that we do have, or are they?
Thank you, Congressman Pallone, and you're always welcome at the Gila River Indian Community. And with USF funding, stable funding mechanisms are critical to businesses like GRTI and those in Indian Country, where they have to develop deployment plans and rely on federal funding sources to be there to begin with. Now, our U.S. funding is critical as well for providing funding for infrastructure build-out, and that's critical to the long-term sustainability of these telecommunications providers in Indian Country.
Now, are you able to, are you using funds from Universal Service now?
Yes, we are.
And how is that working? What does it mean? How do you do it?
That's critical to the overall business plan of Gila River Telecommunications. You know, that they rely on that source of income moving forward. It's critical to the long-term business outlook and also in regards to long-term capital build-out as well.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a great panel. I appreciate you all being here. I want to go to Adelstein, Commissioner, and Governor Lewis real quick to highlight the challenges, because especially the environmental review process, especially on federal lands, is a burden. So have you thought through how local municipalities and they do their zoning outside of federal land, and how we could marry that with which goes on there? And can you comment on that?
Yes, you know, some localities are great. I mean, what we heard today from Google and from Deb Socha is that those communities that promote broadband make it easier to get access, and that's where the investment goes. And those that throw up roadblocks, not to name any specific parts of the country represented by folks here, but there are some that aren't seeing the investment they would get if they weren't throwing up roadblocks. And to the question of Congresswoman Eshoo about, you know, people saying not in my backyard, well, then they're not going to have service in their backyard. So we work very cooperatively with local communities. I mean, we try to, every single facility that's been cited has been cited in cooperation with the local government. But to have it be dragged out, it took the work of this committee to say you don't have to get another zoning hearing for something that's already been zoned to put a 4G antenna up on a tower that's already there. Why should the committee have to do that? Increasingly, communities are recognizing this. The smart ones are moving ahead. 10 states have enacted laws in the last several years, since 2013, to streamline deployment in their states. And those states are seeing more investment. We're working with our local partners at the National Association of Counties and National League of Cities and others to get out word about the way the FCC is implementing the law that you passed. Commissioner Clyburn asked us to go out.
Let me get to
work-
Governor
work
Lewis
together.
on the federal properties, because that's another big challenge, because they got to get past the government land issue. And Governor, really the question is, can't we force a zoning issue, get you guys the zoning ability like we do municipalities?
Yes, there's a bill that was introduced in the other body by Senator Rubio that would create a standard fee schedule, fee retention for the agency, that the agency could keep the money they get from that to pay for the cost of processing it. There would be common forms and contracts, which you've already tried to get enacted, but there's a need for more legislation to get them to do what you asked them to do already. There's an expectancy of lease renewals, so when somebody invests there, they're not going to get cut off.
Let me get Governor Lewis to respond.
Federal lands on Indian country, that's been a long issue in regards to, our unique situation as Indian tribes and the nature of Indian land in regards to highly fractionated land interests that, are just so critical and sometimes are one of the major obstacles to build-outs in regards to getting right-of-ways. If we can somehow streamline that process through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, through the Department of Interior, that would greatly help out tribal infrastructure build-out in the future.
Great, thank you. Mr. Sling, let me go to you real quick. My largest community, my congressional district is 33,000 people. When do you think Google would hit that community on your timeline?
Did you want to name that community? And it's
Well,
But I'm not the chairman of the committee, so I don't have as much power as...
we've published this fiber checklist so that we can, as Mr. Adelstein said, get cities to get ready by themselves for fiber deployment, whether it's Google Fiber or any other provider, by making sure that they have smooth permitting processes that allow for a large volume of permits to go through, to make it easy for people to get onto telephone poles through streamlined make-ready engineering and construction.
So it's the same type of debate as we're talking with the rural or the federal lands deployment, the ease of being able to have access and a timely response. And let me finish up with Mr. Moffett. It's all about return on investment. I don't care how people want to marry it if you believe in the capitalist model. So if a rural area can't make a go based upon the formula, then you have to be able to dip into RUS or other forms of low-interest loans to make the business sense. Is that correct?
That's exactly correct, yeah.
And also, time is money. So any delay, as what we've just talked about here, affects the ability for someone to go to the capital markets to make a pitch that they're going to get the return on investment that you propose.
That's correct as well, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
gentleman yields back his time. Chair now goes gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle, for 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for this excellent hearing and this excellent panel. Jonathan, welcome back. Thank you. Broadband infrastructure has become a critical component to almost every facet of our daily lives, from students using Blackboard for school or watching Netflix and Amazon to stream movies and TV shows, and by all levels of government to communicate with citizens and increasingly leverage the network to improve the delivery and efficiency of services. Pittsburgh, in partnership with Carnegie Mellon University and Google, is deploying a connected platform that will integrate road sensors, traffic cameras, and information kiosks to create a living laboratory at a city scale for the next generation technologies. This platform will be used to improve traffic patterns in real time, allowing city departments to efficiently predict road wear and schedule maintenance, and to allow people to explore and interact with the city more effectively. Fast, available, and ubiquitous broadband infrastructure provides the basis for these next-generation solutions. I, for one, am a big fan of making every tool in the toolbox available to local governments to make sure that they have access to the best networks and the best platforms in order to improve the lives of the people living there. Mr. Chairman, I would love to work with you on putting together some legislation to address some of these challenges. Let me start with Ms. Sosha. How can localities leverage shared infrastructure to expand access and increase the deployment of broadband. As cities like Pittsburgh build this infrastructure to address our own municipal needs, how can we and other municipalities use what we are building to expand access more broadly, and what, if anything, stands in the way of municipalities leveraging the infrastructure?
Really interesting work has been done all over the country, as you suggested. Many of our cities are using smart infrastructure to do really interesting work, determine particulates in the air and checking asthma rates, and using street lights that also have cameras in them for public safety. We're seeing a lot more of that happen, and I think there are barriers for cities to doing this work as well, and some of them are the state regulations that prohibit their building out their own infrastructure, and in some cases it is, as was mentioned earlier, issues of how densely populated, the circumstances of their current financial situation. All of those things impact the capacity of a city to actually build out their own.
Thanks. Mr. Slinger, I'm curious, what dividends has Google Fiber found in communities where you've deployed your gigabit broadband to? Has it impacted jobs or the local economy or education or local government? What are you finding in these communities?
Oh, yes, we're seeing a great economic impact, and we're hearing, yes, we're seeing great economic impact in the cities that we're in. There have been reports in Kansas City, Missouri is now working on an economic impact analysis. Let me start by saying there are certain categories of employees where there's no unemployment. There's obviously, when you build a big network, there's a lot of demand for jobs for certain types of labor. And I think last week, the Fiber to the Home Council released some research that showed that GDP growth in cities with a gig network rises, and the average cost per home, or average value of a home, goes up 3.1% in those cities, and that's new data from about a week ago. But we also see, and we've heard from Mayor Holland and Mayor James in Kansas City, that they've seen it as a draw to regional economic development. Other companies, when deciding where to locate in the Midwest, will now look at Kansas City and say, hey, this place has a gig network, let's join.
I'm curious, too, about the discrepancies that exist between price and speed. In Pittsburgh, for instance, I can get 500 megabits a second, but it would cost me about $400 a month. When we look at cities like Chattanooga and Kansas City and Austin and other cities, residents can get a gig for less than $100. I'm curious, maybe Mr. Moffett, Mr. Slinger, and Ms. Socia, you could comment on why you think these discrepancies exist.
Thank you for the question. My observation would be, you're right, there are a very wide range of economic models, and it's a challenge because there is no near-term variable cost that dictates a cost-plus model. And so you see a lot of companies experimenting with different prices, in part because they're trying to figure out what the quantity demanded will be at different prices. The challenge, but obviously you tend to have lower prices where you have multiple competing networks, and then again it raises the question of whether the providers are earning a sufficient return at the market share and the prices that they're charging. In many cases they're not. This is a very difficult area to do economic research, however, because you will find that there are a lot of the companies who have different motives rather than simply profitability of the network itself.
I want to give Mr. Slinger just because I know our time is up.
Yeah, we've got to go to
2
other
seconds
members.
to answer.
Well, I would say that if you look at the cities in which we're already operating or cities where we've announced, we've seen incumbent prices drop immediately and speeds go up. So I think there's more room there.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Now go to the gentleman from Louisiana, the whip of the House, Mr. Scalise, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you having this hearing. And Mr. Adelstein, I know you talked in your opening statement about a lot of the work that's been done to expand spectrum. Of course, a lot of that within this committee where we've come together to make more spectrum available. I know the chairman has been a great leader in that effort, too. One part of that equation absolutely is expanding more spectrum. And then, of course, the other part of that is your members, where y'all come in to actually go and build it out and to build that infrastructure to take advantage of the new spectrum. If you could maybe share with us some of the challenges or hurdles that your members face to make the investment that they need to make to take advantage of that spectrum, as hopefully we even make more spectrum available in the marketplace.
Yes, spectrum has been quite a hurdle. You saw that $41 billion was spent for a limited amount of spectrum recently, basically 65
It's a little bit better than the CBO estimate, Mr. Chairman, wasn't it?
Which was zero, and it was 41.9 billion. Go ahead.
Hopefully, CBO recognizes the value of the spectrum that clearly everyone else seems to know about.
I think CBO estimated zero, and it was 41.9 billion, so they're off.
They were off by a little bit there, yeah.
41 point, yeah. So, but the fact is that was for a 12% increase in the available commercial mobile spectrum. So you just got a 12% increase in the throughput, and you have 700% you need in the next 5 years. So we're down to 688%. A long way to go to build out to meet the needs of people. And as I said, local communities often are saying no to these facilities. We have the business case has to be made in rural areas, as we've discussed today. And overall return on investment is very difficult with those prices for spectrum. With the price we're going on, revenues are under a lot of pressure right now. We can't afford to have regulatory drag on these investments, slowing them down, making it more expensive when there's not enough capital to build out to meet these needs already. I like to joke, you're in trouble in your quick solutions infrastructure, but that's kind of where we're at in this country. And as slow as it is, it's immediately available when it's built. You can take that same spectrum and reuse it. So all of these burdens on federal lands in urban areas, the FCC's done a great job. This committee's done a great job of trying to address that, but we need to work with our partners in state and local governments as well.
Yeah, and clearly on federal lands, too, we've been grappling with that here, trying to remove some of those burdens, not just in the spectrum space, in a whole lot of other areas, especially as it relates even to energy production, where federal lands and even in the local areas, some of those restrictions make it really hard to experience a lot of the economic opportunity we can. Thanks for that answer. Mr. Moffitt, I want to ask you, in some of your analysis, if you could share with us some of those similar challenges that, where some actions maybe that Congress or the FCC can take to further expand the opportunities for Wi-Fi, for broadband.
Well, as I said earlier, I think there are opportunities in Connect America funds and making those available to a wider range of companies for bringing broadband to rural areas. But there is an overarching question here, and it relates to the question that Ranking Member Eshoo asked earlier about where are the bright spots. If you think about this as a larger value chain of microeconomics, from everything from the content companies and the internet providers to the infrastructure providers, where the bright spots are is very clearly outside of infrastructure. The apps developers and the content companies are actually earning extraordinary returns, and there is a very knee-jerk and familiar regulatory impulse to say, let's try to protect the companies that are making very high returns from the ones that are making very low returns. As an economist, that's a very odd structure.
Gotcha. Well, final question, as I'm running out of time, Mr. Slinger. When Google Fiber was being deployed, it's been reported y'all were able to work with some local governments that gave some exemptions, maybe some expedited approval processes, so that not just your but other new entrants were able to move things a lot quicker. Just if you could talk in general about the ability for more local governments to take more of that deregulatory approach, and how deregulation in the sense of helping expedite the expansion of technology has helped you and could help others to develop even more broadband.
Sure, and I'm going to go back to the fiber checklist, which we published in 2014. Some of our major barriers, obviously, are getting access to poles and making it easy to do the make-ready construction and get the poles ready. One thing that has been suggested, I believe, by the Fiber to the Home Council was if municipalities took a proactive step in doing pole maintenance while they're doing pole maintenance, if they could do that make-ready, get rid of the old wires that aren't needed, and make slots that would allow new entrants, Google Fiber or any other entrant, to get in quickly and attach to poles, that's one thing that would really help. And again, dig once policies and access to the right-of-way. There's more we can do with local communities and more we could do with federal highways to make sure that if someone's ripping up a road to do construction or repaving, that we put in conduit that anyone can use. Those are just smart things. They allow new market entrants and ultimately more competition and choice at the local level.
Thanks for your answers. Yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Unfortunately, we're going to have to pull this to a close because we're down to about 4 minutes left in the vote. This is not the last hearing. We expect to continue this work going forward. Your testimony has just gotten us to a really good starting place. We got a lot of more work to do, some follow-up to do. I know there are members who have didn't get a chance to ask questions. We do have information to submit from for the record, including from TIA, CompTel, CCA, Tech Freedom. Mr. Olson, I believe you had a document you wanted to submit some articles on broadband deployment. And with that, I'm afraid we're going to, unless Ms. Matsui, do you want just a minute or two?
Yes, just a minute or two, just
Go
a
ahead.
bit of here.
No.
I was curious, I wanted to ask Mr. Slinger some questions. I find it, what you're talking about, very interesting, because I look at this and what you say is all very important about deploying broadband infrastructure. And I'm from Sacramento, so we have wonderful areas that are doing great things. But I'm looking at a particular area in our city that is economically deprived. And we have a light rail station that's going to be, a light rail line that's going to be completed there with fiber and transit-oriented development stations. But yet, we have schools and libraries that are just deprived, and business people there who just have no access. If we were to do something there, and I don't know whether we can have a special project, but I'm looking at this being very, very special for economic development. Is that something, if we can provide the access, as you say that you need, is that something that you or somebody else can take on as a project working with us? Because I'm trying very much to help this area that feels very deprived, looking at the rest of my district that feel like they're on the move, and they're not on the move. And I want to get them on the move. Is there something we could do there?
Yes, there's a lot that we do really early stage with all of the cities that we look at to make sure that they have the right kind of digital inclusion plans in place early that make sure that the cities have a focus on it. And again, there's no silver bullet with any one company, but we want to make sure that all providers and local community groups take this on. And as fiber or any other technology is built out in those areas, to really make sure people understand the relevancy of the web and hopefully get more people online.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We are going to have to call it to a conclusion here. Again, we do have votes on the House floor, followed by the uranium briefing. So thank you to all of you for your testimony, your counsel. We'll look forward to being back in touch with you as we move forward, and to others who have ideas for the Congress on how we can expand access to affordable broadband across the country, on Indian reservations, rural communities, urban communities, wherever it is not. And we have some other, I understand, some tribal letters for the record as well from Mr. Lujan, which we're happy to accept. And with that, we will adjourn.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Well done. Yes.
Yeah.